Being trapped in a rusty old submarine at the bottom of a blood ocean sounds pretty scary, huh? What if it was an ocean of beans instead? And before you ask, yes, this is all happening in the game. I could have just done it in After Effects, but hacking the game sounded like a lot more fun. Besides, turning the blood ocean into beans was hardly my goal here. I originally wanted to find out what was happening behind the scenes in a game that shows you very little. If you didn't catch my video from a few months ago, this is Iron Lung, a spooky, low-res horror game about exploring an alien blood ocean in a rickety old submarine. I talked about all the interesting things the game does in that video, so go ahead and watch that if you've never heard of it before. But now that everyone's had ample time to play it, I decided to do a follow-up video. Not just to talk about spoilers, but to actually find out what's outside those rusty iron walls. Since the game is obviously designed to keep you blind to the outside world, I knew that I had to take an unconventional approach to reveal its secrets. Now, I recently did a video on creating a Subnautica mod from scratch, and in that I mentioned how some of the methods used to run arbitrary code could probably be applied to lots of Unity games. And it just so happens that Iron Lung was also made in Unity. Plus, I've made a handful of Unity games myself, so I'm pretty familiar with how they're structured behind the scenes. All of this came together as a perfect opportunity to experiment with some methods for hacking Unity games. A couple days worth of research and lots of trial and error later, and I was finally able to get my own code running inside of Iron Lung. I'll talk a little bit about the technical side later, but for now, let's see what everybody came here for and find out what's outside that submarine. Well, it's not entirely what I expected. Clipping out of the submarine and having a look around reveals a vast, endless darkness in all directions. We can see a bunch of interior objects expand past the walls, but that's not too surprising. Lots of games clip objects through walls, knowing that players will likely never see the parts that are out of bounds. Like this classic example from Skyrim. Instead of having the artists make new props for small tables, they just clip the shelves into the ground. It's a pretty simple trick, but most players never even notice it. Game dev is full of this sort of stuff. Anything that helps ship the final project within the deadline. But if a few extended props was all that I had to show, I could just end the video here. On the contrary, there's actually a ton of stuff outside the submarine, it's just that most of it is surprisingly hard to find. But before moving on to that, there are a few things worth pointing out here, like how the intro of the game puts a red plane and some bubbles in front of the window until it closes. Since the submarine is actually surrounded by complete darkness, the effects here are just used to simulate the initial descent into the abyss. Also interesting is that most of the interior objects have repeating textures you can also see from the outside. Oh, and that there really is nothing behind either the window or the monitor screen. When you take a picture, you see objects that do exist in the world, but not in the way that you'd think. And this is where I hit my first major roadblock. I wrote a little code to print out all the active objects in the scene, and I could clearly see that things like bones and terrain existed. But why couldn't I see them? I tried teleporting the objects directly in front of the camera, but nothing showed up. Teleporting the camera to the objects instead just put me into a black void, super far away from the sub. So then I tried grabbing the renderer property from various objects and manually turning it on. Still nothing. I even tried changing the camera's clipping distance to a really large number, making sure that they weren't hidden somewhere out of the visible range. And to top it all off, I added a bit of code to create a giant light source emanating from the camera. This lit up the sub pretty well, but I still couldn't see anything beyond that. After trying countless things, I thought back to how Unity can bypass rendering objects. You see, there's this thing called a culling mask, which allows you to set which groups of objects should be visible. Like if you turned off grass in a game. The objects usually still exist, but you don't have to waste processing power rendering them. So I tried overriding the culling mask to show everything, looked outside the sub, and to my surprise I saw some faint gray stuff off in the distance. So I flew on over to check it out, and what do you know, there's the entire world. It's a lot more obvious when you look at it from the top down, perfectly lines up with the in-game map that you're given. And if we get in closer, we can see that the various sites you're supposed to photograph actually do exist in the world. Since you never need to see them in first person, the game just defaults to not rendering them. Meanwhile, the sub's onboard camera can easily take a picture at the designated coordinates to show on the screen. The sub doesn't need to physically move through the world, and objects can be optimized down to being basically invisible, all because of the unique restrictions the game imposes with its story. It's a pretty clever solution, and certainly not what I expected going into this, but it works, and nobody would ever know, at least until now. I should also mention that the game does have some behind the scenes screenshots in the goodies folder. You can see some early dev pictures, including the terrain that we ended up finding after all that time. But even after seeing those screenshots, you'd still probably think that the sub moves through the world normally, because why wouldn't it? But as we saw, the sub never moves from its starting position. Instead, the game just tracks your coordinates and uses that as an analog for moving through the world. So if nothing else, I'm at least happy to reveal a few interesting tricks here and there. Game dev is all about unique solutions to problems, and this is a great example of that mindset. But there's one more thing I didn't talk about: the ending. Yeah, that huge jump scare that the entire game builds up to. What's actually happening there? Well, let's take a look. Okay, so obviously I figured out how to replace the monster's material and slap on a picture of Shrek instead. I almost don't want to tell you how long that little joke took to program. I could go super in depth on how I had to analyze the developer's code to patch my own junk on top of, plus all the struggles in getting it to actually render, but I'll save you all from that snooze fest. The gist is that instead of just strong-arming my own code to pull control away from the game, I had to work in tandem with the original code to trigger the monster and get the whole sequence working. Just like in my Subnautica video, DNSpy was a huge help here. Being able to read a decompiled version of the original code made it a million times easier to see what was really happening. As for actually getting my code to run in the game, I talked a bit more about that in my Subnautica video. The short of it is, I can make use of some tools to inject some code before the game fully starts up. I then use this injection to create an object in the world that holds all my custom code and persists through any scene changes. This allows me to do basically anything that I want, if I can figure out how to make it work in harmony with the game's code. But that's my allotted code talk time for the video, before all the non-programmers start clicking away. Point is, if I wanted to trigger the monster, I could, and he would simply float off into the distance with no end in sight. Since you're never supposed to see it from a different angle, there actually isn't much past its face. Just a low-res texture stretched across a cone-like shape. And once we trigger the ending, you can see that the conclusion screen actually plays over the game itself. I don't know if it'll show up in this video, but there's a sliver of the submarine on the right side of the screen behind the overlay. Just one last little trick before we're taken back to the ocean of beans. So that's Iron Lung behind the scenes, albeit in a very roundabout way. Not nearly as efficient as just talking to the developer, but a whole lot more fun. Like I said before, my Subnautica modding video sparked the idea to try hacking any random Unity game, and this was a great proof of concept. I'm fairly confident now that similar techniques could be applied to a whole slew of Unity games. It was a lot of fun figuring all this out, even with all the setbacks along the way. So if you liked this video and want to see more like it, definitely let me know. Or if you have any other Unity games you think would be cool to break apart, I'd love to hear them in the comments. And as usual, subscribing is always greatly appreciated. With that, I think we can wrap this one up. Remember kids, Beans Ocean isn't real and the Shrek fish can't hurt you. Unless...